I still remember the first time I saw a human laugh during a crisis meeting. It was strange to me. My translator implant struggled to process it. Every other species in the room was tense, gripping the edges of the table, watching the projection of a burning outpost. But the human delegate, a woman named Officer Reyes, just leaned back and said something like, "Well, that could have gone worse," and smiled. I am Vexiri, a historian for the Galactic Council Archive. For over 300 cycles, I have recorded the histories of 100 different species. I have studied wars fought with honor, wars fought with rules, wars that lasted centuries but never truly hurt anyone beyond the soldiers who signed up to fight them. War, in our part of the galaxy, was almost polite. There were treaties about how much damage was allowed. There were limits on which weapons could be used on which worlds. There were seasons for fighting, just like there were seasons for harvest. Then humanity arrived. At first, we thought they were simple. They came from a small, damp planet with only one moon, and they seemed eager to please. They signed every agreement we offered. They followed our customs, even the strange ones, like standing 3 steps back when greeting an elder. They asked polite questions about our history and told very few stories about their own. If you had asked me back then, I would have said humans were shy, quiet, almost nervous. I did not understand yet. None of us did. It happened during my second cycle stationed near the edge of human territory. A neighboring empire, the Threll Dominion, had grown frustrated with a border dispute. The Threll were proud fighters, masters of the old rules, the kind of warriors who painted their ships and sang before every battle. They decided to test the young species that had joined our council with so little fuss. They moved their fleet toward a small human colony on the edge of neutral space. It was meant to be a warning, nothing more, a show of strength. According to every rule we knew, the humans were supposed to send a formal protest, perhaps gather allies, perhaps negotiate for weeks. That was how these things worked. Instead, the humans responded within a single day. I was not there myself, but I read every report afterward, and I later visited the colony to see it with my own eyes. The Threll fleet, which had expected posturing and diplomacy, found itself facing something it did not recognize. The humans did not follow the traditional rituals of challenge and response. They did not wait for formal declarations. They acted immediately, decisively, and with total focus. Within hours, the Threll fleet was disabled and forced to retreat, their pride shattered more than their ships. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. The humans did not chase the retreating fleet. They did not demand punishment or humiliation. They offered medical aid to the injured Threll soldiers who could not evacuate in time. They returned captured equipment. They asked for nothing except an apology and a promise that the border would be respected going forward. The Threll Dominion agreed almost immediately. I heard later that their commander, a proud old warrior named Vel, requested a private meeting with the human officer who had led the response. I managed to get access to the recording, years later, once it was declassified. Vel had asked, "Why did you not finish us? We were open to you. You could have destroyed my entire fleet." The human officer, a young man named Captain Okafor, had simply replied, "We're not interested in the ending you're imagining. We just wanted it to stop." That answer confused Vel. It confused me too, when I first read it. It confused most of the galaxy. We had grown used to wars that dragged on for the sake of pride, for the sake of ritual, for the sake of proving strength again and again. Humans seemed to skip all of that. They responded fast, they responded fully, and then they simply returned to peace, as if none of it had ever needed to happen. I decided to study this. I requested permission to travel to Earth, to walk among humans and understand what made them behave this way. My request was approved, and I spent the next several cycles living among them, learning their language properly, instead of relying on translation devices, and reading their history for myself. What I found surprised me more than anything I had learned in 300 cycles of study. Humanity's own history was filled with terrible conflicts, long before they ever left their home planet. They fought 2 wars that touched almost their entire world. Wars that killed more people than entire species in our galaxy had ever lost combined. And near the end of the second one, they discovered a kind of weapon that could end a city in a single moment. They used it only twice. Then they stopped. I read transcripts from that era, old and yellowed with time, kept carefully in human archives. Scientists and leaders from that time wrote about what they had built, and many of them were horrified by their own success. One scientist, a man named Oppenheimer, was recorded saying something that stayed with me long after I read it. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He was quoting an old text from his planet, but the weight of his own guilt was clear in every word. After that, humanity spent decades living under the shadow of what they had created. Entire generations grew up practicing safety drills for a war that never fully happened. because both sides understood, with total clarity, what would happen if it did. Historians call it the Cold War, though nothing about it was calm. It was a long, quiet standoff between two great powers, each one holding enough destructive force to end nearly all life on their planet, each one terrified of what would happen if either side ever truly let go. Humans built systems specifically to prevent themselves from making a mistake. They built rules layered on top of rules. They trained people for years just to make sure that no single person could ever act alone. They were not afraid of each other, not exactly. They were afraid of themselves. They had seen how easily their own anger, mixed with enough power, could destroy everything they loved. They never forgot that lesson. By the time humans reached the stars, that fear had become part of who they were. It was not weakness, it was memory. It was a species that had looked into the deepest, darkest part of its own potential and decided, collectively, never to go there again, unless there was truly no other choice. I began to understand, then, why humans behaved so differently from every other species I had studied. Our wars were rituals because we had never truly seen what unrestrained conflict could do to an entire world. Humans had. They carried that memory with them, generation after generation, like a scar that never quite faded, and it shaped every decision they made about conflict, right down to how they responded to that first Threll fleet. I spoke with an elderly human historian named Professor Adeyeze Bello during my time on Earth. She had spent her career studying humanity's old conflicts, and she explained it to me in words simpler than any council document I had ever read. "We don't fight for pride anymore," she told me. "We fight to end things quickly, because we know exactly how bad it can get if we don't." Every human leader who has ever held real power has had to learn that lesson, sometimes the hard way. We built a whole culture around never forgetting it. I asked her if humans were afraid of war. She smiled, but it was not a happy smile. "We're not afraid of war," she said. "We're afraid of what happens after, if it goes too far. That's a very different kind of fear. It doesn't make us weak. It makes us careful." I carried that conversation with me for a long time. It changed how I understood every report I had read about humanity's actions among the stars. There was a second event, a few cycles later, that proved this theory beyond any doubt. Another council power, a proud and ancient empire called the Cenovar Concord, decided that the incident with the Threll had been a fluke. Perhaps the humans had simply gotten lucky. Perhaps they had a single skilled commander who would not always be available. The Cenovar were patient and calculating, unlike the passionate Threll, and they tested humanity carefully, over months, probing borders, testing patience, watching for weakness. Humanity did not respond immediately this time. They gave warnings. They tried diplomacy. They sent representatives to council meetings and asked, again and again, for the Cenovar to step back. I attended some of those meetings myself. I watched human diplomats stay calm, patient, almost gentle in their requests, even as the Cenovar continued pushing. But there is a point where patience runs out, even for humans. When the Cenovar finally crossed a line that could not be ignored, threatening a human research station with civilians aboard, the response was different from before. It was not chaotic. It was not driven by anger. It was calm, precise, and overwhelming. Within a very short time, the Cenovar fleet found itself completely unable to continue its advance. Its ships disabled one after another, with a level of coordination that left their commanders stunned. There was no long battle. There was no drawn-out siege. It was over almost before it truly began. And then, again, it stopped. I was present for the peace negotiations that followed, standing quietly at the back of the room as council representative. The Cenovar commander, an old and dignified being named Threx Uhl, looked exhausted and shaken as he faced the human representative across the table. It was Captain Okafor again, older now, his hair touched with gray, but his calm expression unchanged from the recording I had watched years before. Threx Uhl asked the question that everyone in that room was thinking. "You could have destroyed us completely. Why show mercy?" Captain Okafor was quiet for a moment before he answered. "It's not mercy," he said. "It's memory. We know what happens when things go too far. We've been there before, on our own world, long before we ever met any of you. We never want to go back." He continued, and I wrote down every word he said, because I knew even then that it would matter to history. Every time we're forced to respond like this, it costs us something, not just resources, something quieter than that. We carry it with us, so we make sure it ends the moment it can end, and we make sure it never has to happen again if we can help it. The room was silent after that. I looked around at the other council members, at species who had built entire cultures around the idea that war was simply another form of diplomacy, another way of settling disputes with honor and ritual. I watched their expressions change as they finally understood what humanity truly was. Humans were not a peaceful species by nature. They were a species that had already learned, at great cost to themselves, exactly how far conflict could go if left unchecked. That lesson had been burned into their history, into their stories, into the way they raised their children and trained their leaders. It made them cautious in a way none of the rest of us fully understood, because none of us had ever needed to learn it the way they had. After that day, something changed across the galaxy. Word spread quickly among the council powers. Species that had once considered testing humanity's patience quietly withdrew their plans. Old rivals who might have pushed at human borders chose instead to seek peaceful agreements, trade deals, cultural exchanges. It was not because humans threatened anyone, they never did. It was because everyone had seen, twice now, exactly what happened when humanity's patience finally ran out, and no one wanted to be the third example. I returned to Earth one final time before completing this record, many cycles later. I wanted to see how ordinary humans lived, away from diplomats and commanders and council meetings. I visited a small town, quiet and green, where children played in open fields and old libraries still kept their paper books carefully preserved. I met a young human girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old by their counting, sitting with her grandmother in front of an old television screen showing footage from decades earlier. The images showed scenes from humanity's difficult history, faded and gray, and the girl watched with quiet curiosity. "Grandma," she asked, "why do you get so quiet when you watch this?" The old woman was silent for a moment, her eyes distant. "Because we never want to forget," she said softly. "As long as we remember how bad it can get, we make sure it never gets that bad again." The girl nodded slowly, though I could tell she did not fully understand yet. She would, someday. Every human eventually did. I finished this record now, sitting in my archive chamber far from Earth, surrounded by the histories of 100 different species. I have documented wars fought with pride, wars fought for territory, wars fought simply because two powers disagreed and saw no better way to settle it. But humanity is different. The galaxy assumes they avoided full-scale wars because they were peaceful, gentle, unwilling to fight. That is not the truth. The truth is quieter and, in some ways, more remarkable. Humans avoided endless wars because they had already seen, on their own world, exactly where unrestrained conflict leads. They carried that memory across the stars with them, and it became their greatest strength. They were not afraid of losing a fight. They were afraid of themselves, of what they were capable of, if they ever let that fear go completely. And so they built an entire culture around remembering, around teaching every new generation the same quiet lesson their grandparents had learned the hard way. That fear did not make them weak. It made the entire galaxy just a little more careful, a little more thoughtful, whenever humanity was involved. In the end, that quiet, private terror humans carried within themselves became the very thing that kept the peace between the stars, long after every other species had learned better than to test it.